Good afternoon and welcome to today's discussion entitled 5 Keys to Successful CME Outcomes Measurement. I am your host, Jeremy Lundberg, CEO of Ethos CE Learning Management System and DLC Solutions. Just a little bit about Ethos CE. Ethos CE is an enterprise-level learning management system that has been specifically designed and developed to streamline and automate the delivery of CME by medical associations, health systems, and academic centers. Ethos CE is ACCME PARS compliant and integrates assessments, evaluations, and transcripts. It supports the delivery of live, enduring, and RSS courses, and has a built-in reporting engine designed to facilitate outcomes measurement. Yet, despite the availability of platforms such as Ethos CE and advances in CME technology, we continue to hear from our CME colleagues that they feel challenged about how to advance and implement formal outcomes assessment methodologies within their organizations. So today I've invited our friends and panelists, Derek Dietze and Dr. Christopher Viereck from ImproveCME.com to discuss their 5 keys to successful CME outcomes measurement. So by way of introduction, Derek is the president of ImproveCME.com, which partners with leading healthcare organizations to help them integrate, analyze, and report on practical outcomes measurement within their CME programs. He is a 20-plus year CME professional, a frequent speaker and accomplished author, a fellow of the Alliance for CE in the Health Professions, and past surveyor of ACCME. Christopher is the Chief Scientific Officer for ImproveCME.com and has over 10 years of experience, including his role as the Vice President of Medical Education at Sanofi Aventis. He has also served as a Clinical Research Associate, Clinical Trial Manager, and Global Head of Medical Writing at Merck, Sanofi Aventis, and Behring Schering. Christopher holds a PhD in developmental neurobiology, has published several research articles, and is a regular reviewer for contemporary clinical trials. Thank you both for joining us today. We greatly appreciate everyone's time here. And having said that, Derek, I will turn the conversation over to you. Thanks so much.
I can't tell you how many times as a kid my mother told me about this with respect to my homework when it was the 11th hour and the night before it was due. So I've tried to learn this, but it's still a challenge for all of us. But planning ahead, way ahead, is really important with respect to CE, CME outcomes measurement. Really having some sort of plan described, articulated in a document at the earliest stages of activity development, whether you're developing a grant request to submit or you're just developing an activity internally, is to have that plan in place. And the best approach, I think, is to think, plan with the end in mind. So it's more about asking questions about the outcomes that you're planning to design, and planning backwards so that you have a way to get where you need to go. And oftentimes the practical aspects of that mean developing your outcomes assessment questions in concert with content, parallel with your content, not as an afterthought, thinking of those, oh my gosh, we finished the activity, now I got to come up with the outcomes questions. You have a much better chance of success if you do that in concert with content development. Also, planning with the end in mind helps you establish whether you have the resources you need to really perform the outcomes as you've planned them. And, we'll look at, we've sometimes had folks who will say that they want to look at performance and patient outcomes in early documents, but really have no specific plan for that. They haven't asked who is going to help us with this, when is it going to be done, how is it going to be done. When you ask those questions, you really get a reality check on what's feasible and what's not. So second key is measuring to your educational design. And here's a couple other questions that really help with outcomes planning. What do you expect to change in your learners? It's surprising how often when we ask this question of our clients, how this question and the next question can actually change and have an impact on the nature of the content. And it's surprising how few people ask these questions. So when you ask, what do you expect to change in your learners, it's really, are you focused on knowledge or filling knowledge gaps that you've identified, or confidence or competence gaps, or have you seen performance issues that you're trying to address? Have you found that patient outcomes aren't what they need to be and you're working to address those? So what do you expect to change? And it's interesting how that can change the content. An example of this, had somebody who's in early planning stages for an activity on depression. And one of the things that they found was that in their needs assessment gap analysis was that clinicians weren't using depression screening tools the way they should or as often as they should. And so when they identified that for us, we said, well, what do you want to change in your learners? One of the answers was, we want them to use this depression screening tool more often. And we said, well, how does your content address that? And the answer was, well, you know, we'll tell them about the tool. I said, how about giving them the tool? Perhaps another idea is to show them how it's used, have them practice using it. So you'll find that as you ask these questions, what do you expect to change and what domains do they fall, that will help you make sure that your content is on track. Another thing is for higher outcomes levels to distinguish between subjective and objective assessment. In your plan, there's a whole lot more resources that typically have to be used for objective outcomes assessment, meaning things like chart pulls, other forms of measurement, perhaps quality assurance, quality improvement data, patient safety data, those kinds of hard-hitting, factual, actual kinds of data, versus subjective, self-reported kinds of levels. And it's important to define those because they have a lot to do with the resources that you'll use. Christopher, any comments on that?
Yeah, I think Derek, I think the point regarding accurately representing the more levels. I don't know. Were you going to get to that next?
No, go ahead. Go ahead.
I think what we had discussed, I think for the audience to know is that the more levels are not always entirely clear in everyone's mind. In other words, there may have been what we use the more levels 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 a lot, but we're not always clear on what exactly we are referring to. So it is important to be very specific about this. And when you're submitting, especially if you're submitting to a commercial supporter for grant support, it is typically required that you do indicate which more level you are going to be measuring. So that's just something else to bear in mind.
Yeah, and if you're not using a more level, if you've got some other kind of model that you're working with, just be specific so the people can anticipate where you're headed with things. So again, continuing on with measure to your design, here's a question to ask, and it's a common thing that people will just assume that, yeah, we got to measure performance change, and we'll do it self-reported, so it'll be subjective in nature, and so we got to have this follow-up survey. Now, it's really important to make that decision understanding what your educational design was. So if the gaps you found were in the knowledge domain and in the competence domain or performance domain, where do your objectives land and how far are you going to go with your measurement? If you're only focused on changing knowledge and competence, people's intention to do something good more often, then why would you have a follow-up survey? to ask about performance and patient outcomes. Now, you can always measure beyond your design, but if your content is designed for knowledge and intention to change, you don't necessarily need to go further in performance and patient outcomes. And you may have success with that, but again, it's a question of resources and timing. If your design is focused on changing knowledge, then perhaps measuring beyond that doesn't do you too many favors, may have less of a chance of optimal results. So here's an example of this, of a mismatch. So a group that was having grand rounds in a variety of hospitals, and it was a 1-hour grand rounds, and they promised performance and patient outcomes results from chart pulls for 1-hour grand rounds. We were so excited at first when we heard that, we might be able to help them with some performance change and so on, but then we started asking questions about what's the nature of the content. And it was 1-hour grand rounds focused on knowledge. And we said, did you talk about performance change? Did you talk about patient care strategies and reinforce the need for those? And so what we discovered was there was a misalignment. So their measurement was not aligned with their design and had less than positive results. So when you do measure to your design, you establish enhanced credibility and a more effective use of resources. You're not going to waste money on unnecessary measurement. And some of you who are submitting grants for commercial support, Christopher, how does measuring to your design enhance your credibility?
Yeah, I think what this, Derek, what this comes down to is, the credibility is very important. It is in the old adage, it is in fact better to underpromise and then overdeliver than it is to overpromise and underdeliver. So it may look great that you're requesting a grant and it's a relatively modest amount of money, and for this modest amount of money, you're claiming that you're going to be able to measure a performance change. But in reality, that may be very, very difficult to do if you really think everything through. And the next time you submit a grant, the commercial supporter may say, well, let's go back and have a look at what this provider has done in the past, and that may come back to haunt you. So it certainly is it is really important that you do deliver to your design, and that will help you in the long run.
And we realize, of course, that grants that are small amounts of money, $2,500, $5,000, have different expectations from a commercial supporter in terms of outcomes assessment, generally, than would grants of much more, tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars. And so, but being realistic here and measuring to design, we believe gets you the credibility. So I guess we move on to another polling question.
Right, so what we'd like you to answer here is we'd like you to rate self-assessment here. Rate your confidence. What is your confidence in aligning your outcomes questions to your learning objectives and the learning gaps in the program? So please select one of these, one being not confident at all. I'm not confident at all in aligning outcomes, to number 5, the other end, which is I am extremely confident in aligning outcomes. So off you go. Eagerly awaiting the results.
A few more seconds here.
Give you a couple more seconds, yep. Okay. So it looks like we are somewhere kind of right in the middle, I guess. It looks like 60, about 2/3 are somewhat confident, with a pretty broad tail going off one in not very confident, others in very confident. So very few at the two extremes. So Derek, I think that's a pretty good place to continue on with.
Great. Yeah. Really, if there is one key out of the 5 that we're talking about today, this perhaps may be the most important for outcomes success. And it's really about alignment. Align, align, align. So recently I was driving down the street in my car, and I have a van. And what I noticed was I was going straight, but as I was holding the steering wheel was off to the left, even though I was going straight. So obviously something was wrong with my steering. I was worried about my alignment. I took it into the shop, and they checked it out. Now, I've had misalignment problems before. I've been on the highway misaligned in my car, and things start vibrating. It's starting to pull me off to one side or the other, pulling me off course. It wears my tires unevenly, and there's safety implications, of course, when you're misaligned. It's kind of similar with CME, CE, and these items that we've listed here with alignment. When these things are not aligned, you can go off course to varying extents, to the extent that you're misaligned. So we're really suggesting one of the major keys to success in outcomes measurement is this alignment, that the gaps you've identified, and we all work on gaps in identifying gaps in knowledge and performance and patient outcomes, identifying those in a variety of ways. But when you nail the gaps with real, tangible information that goes beyond people stating an interest in a topic, when you get down to verifying that gaps really do exist, that's the firm foundation that you have for your outcomes assessment. And if your learning objectives, a realistic set of learning objectives, are meant to address the gaps, and we realize that you can't necessarily address all of the gaps you've found, you're going to pick the ones that are realistic for you in your setting. But when those are aligned, that adds to a firm foundation. Identifying desired results. What do we want to change in our learners? Aligning that also with instructional design. What kind of design in live or web-based or however we're going to do this is going to deliver us or help us to fulfill those objectives, fill those gaps. That you've actually got content that addresses the learning objectives, that focuses on the gaps. That you've got a format that facilitates all of this, and that your outcomes questions are directly linked back. If you're asking outcomes questions about learning about things other than are focused on in your learning objectives, and about things other than where you're trying to fill the gaps, you have much less of a chance of success. And so how can you plan this alignment? So it's helpful in planning documents to demonstrate that alignment. And I know that we've seen folks very effectively use a chart, right, Christopher?
Right. Yeah. And Derek, what we like to suggest is a chart that has for a given gap, a given learning gap, some very specific learning objectives that are directly tied to the gap, and along the same row, looking at what it is you're trying to change for that gap and that learning objective, whether it's knowledge, competence, whether it's performance, and then you continue on with the other components, instructional design, making sure that you have content as well, and making sure that the format is amenable, and that you're assessing this gap with the right types of outcomes questions that line up with all of the other components.
Yeah, and just a generic example, a misalignment example, is that just somebody who writes outcomes questions that aren't really tied to the content, they're done with no context, written with no context of the content, the learning objectives, and the gaps. And they may be cool, interesting questions, but they're not aligned. There's no content that really specifically hits on those questions, and they're not linked to objectives and gaps. And what happens is, if you're using, for instance, pre-post questions that aren't aligned, you're not going to see any change because the alignment was way off. And there's no way to tell if the degree to which you met your learning objectives, because the questions you asked aren't linked to them. So a practical kind of approach to this, under examples on this slide, is really, if you can link each learning objective to a specific gap, that's often done way early in the planning process. Also, if each outcomes assessment question is linked to a specific learning objective. And what I do when I write these questions is I have in front of me on my desk, either on paper or on a screen. It's nice I have two screens. I have the gaps that were identified, the learning objectives, and the content. And those are the things I need in front of me to really craft meaningful outcomes measurement questions and to make sure that the linkage is there. And I know the software, the learning management system software that Jeremy works in, facilitates this also. So when your alignment is good, you have, we believe, the best chances of success.
And Derek, I guess we're not telling people that they have to have two screens to do this, right?
No, just maybe a couple pieces of paper.
A big piece of paper will do it. Or you can have three screens like Jeremy, yeah.
Well, some people, in fact, will have all of this outlined way in advance and in a chart that you described, and they will then just work from that to craft the questions, or have a medical writer craft the questions, or a faculty member can use those. But honestly, it does require a little bit of work. If you're having faculty write questions, there's often some training or education needed to help them with that alignment. It does take some time to make that happen. So,
so we're gonna take another polling question here from you, and what we'd like you to do here is we're going to talk about some of the specificity issues and some of the ambiguity issues that we alluded to earlier, and discuss those a little bit further. So this is the question: when you promise level 5 outcomes results in a grant proposal, what does this mean to you? So there are various options here. So one is, does this mean you're going to include chart pulls in your grant application based on participant performance? Does it mean you're going to look at performance changes, self-reported performance changes by the participants? Does it mean you're going to ask them what performance changes they plan on undertaking? Are you going to ask them about patient outcomes reported by a participant? Or is your answer, I have absolutely no idea? So, and this is great. We have a bunch of very honest people out there. So we have a chart pull, we have self-reported, subjective, objective, or I should say objective, subjective, respectively. We have about 42% saying I have absolutely no idea, and very, very, very nice results actually.
Yeah, I think the first two answers, that when you say this, level 5 outcomes results means chart pull data, and we got a group of people indicating that, and others saying performance changes self-reported by participants. That's really what we're getting at here. We purposely had all of this ambiguity in this because level 5 can mean different things to different people. And as a result, if you, for instance, promised this in a grant request or even internally, what does it really mean? So, more at all defined differences in level 5 outcomes results is subjective and objective, where your response number 1 would be chart pull data, would be objective data on performance change from chart, and number 2 would be subjective. So it's really important in your planning to specify kind of where you're headed with this. Any other comments, Christopher?
No, I think that's it. If some supporters may consider level 5 outcomes results as being a little ambiguous, if they think that what you mean is you're going to include chart pulls, and what in fact you had intended was that you were just going to have some subjective self-reported changes reported by the participants, then you may get into a credibility problem with for the future. So it is really important. Derek, it would appear that our needs assessment for the web, and Jeremy, our needs assessment for the webinar was spot on, because a good proportion of people responded to this one very honestly, and we do appreciate that. I have absolutely no idea. So,
well, that could also mean that they've identified that this is a particularly ambiguous question. It
yep.
really it's not specific enough. So,
right.
No right answer per se. But thank you for recognizing, of course, that was not patient outcomes.
Yep.
So we're on to key number 4, which is to keep the plan simple and specific. So this is really about addressing in your planning the what, the how, and the when. A lot of people will miss the when also. So you can talk about what you're going to measure, and generally that means at what level you're going to discuss things or measure things. How is a little bit more detail on the practical methods that you're going to use. Either we're going to use quality assurance, quality improvement, or patient safety data in some particular way, and here's when we're going to collect it. Or we're going to be asking people about their commitments to change in an evaluation form at the end of the activity. Or we're going to use an ARS system to ask pre and post knowledge, confidence, and competence questions. We think there'll be about 5 questions, pre and post. So getting down to those levels of specificity really help you in early planning stages. And if you want a detailed plan, and this is particularly necessary and we think helps in a commercial support when you're asking for commercial support, is to include the items that we've listed here. So outcomes objectives, those aren't your learning objectives. Those are what you want to accomplish with your outcomes. We want to measure X, Y, Z. We want to measure levels, changes in knowledge and competence. We want to use those results to establish the effectiveness of the activity, the degree to which we met the learning objectives, and we wanted to use it to improve future CME. Those could be some of your objectives. Your overall methods, which is how you're generally going to approach your measurement. Activity-specific outcomes details. So if you have multiple components in an initiative, why not describe a little bit about how you're measuring and assessing each one? Rather than listing your activities and saying, we're going to measure knowledge change. Well, how are you going to do it live versus how you're going to do it online? Are you going to do, some people say, we're going to measure up to level 5 on all of these activities. Well, how are you going to do that? Thinking through those details really helps you, again, understand the resources you need. Don't be scared by needing to explain your statistical analysis. In many cases, you're going to be using descriptive statistics, which might be percentages and numbers of people, or what we call frequencies, means, mean scores or averages of responses, that kind of thing. But go ahead and describe that. That sets up expectations. But if you're going to go further than that and you need to assess changes, say, on your knowledge questions, pre to post, well, what tests are you going to use? What statistical tests? So it's helpful to describe those. And then what is in a results report? People say, well, we'll report the knowledge results. Well, is it going to be in PowerPoint? Is it going to be in Word? How long is it going to be, and what are you going to include in the report? How far is it going to go? And we highly recommend that there's always an executive summary section that is very, very brief and focused, almost like one slide or one page that can be used to crystallize the results of what you did. And also specifying when you're going to be delivering the results. So if you've got an online activity that's going to last 2 years, 1 to 2 years, when's your first report on that going to be? Is it going to be after 2 years? Or are you going to do an interim report on pre-post knowledge change at 6 months when the vast majority of respondents are going to be there already? That just helps you internally as you're planning things. Also, how are you going to share your results? Increasingly, people are learning that just checking the box to say we did our outcomes assessment is insufficient. And clearly it is. If you want to learn and get better in CME, if we all want to do that, we're going to need to spend more time looking at our results and figuring out what to do because of them. So do you have internal audiences that need the results? Your CME committee, the faculty that helped you with this activity? Do you need to get more resources? Can you demonstrate effectiveness to get more resources internally? What about your learners? Do they need to see this? How will this help them? Clearly in a hospital setting where you've been able to convert your grand rounds from interest-based CME to quality improvement and performance improvement dialogues over time with people in a particular specialty or department, seeing those results, evaluating them, and making more plans for change are just key. So those are some thoughts. Anything else that I missed there, Christopher?
No, I think it's all. These are all really, really important points. I think the last one. I mean, actually, I think for all of these, there really have been some big changes with all the pressure on the sources of funding for CME. These 5 points here have become very, very important. And the better you are at doing these things, clearly, the more likely you are to be successful. Especially, I think it's a real paradigm change to begin to really formally report on your results, whether it's a poster or a publication. That's very new, and that will actually help you a lot if you apply for another grant and saying that you've actually had something from a previous grant published.
Yeah, thanks. I think we've covered these points on the next slide. When you have a really nice specific outcomes plan, it becomes an implementation guide. It's there. It helps with timing. It helps those project managers or CME coordinators who are involved really implement what you have in mind. And I think we've established also that if you're overly ambiguous in your plans and over what you describe, it creates misunderstandings. People will think you're delivering objective level performance data when you really had only in mind to ask clinicians in a follow-up survey how they changed their things in their practice. Or if you're too ambitious, it's really important. So many commercial supporters complain that CME providers overpromise and underdeliver, and that's a challenge to overcome. Yeah. And having a clear plan really helps you make sure you have the internal and external resources lined up to do what you're promising. So, key number 5, use multiple types of assessment questions. I call this, if you just use one type of assessment question, meaning if you have only, say, 2 multiple choice knowledge questions, you're putting all your eggs in one basket. If you're measuring knowledge and competence change, mix it up. Use a variety of question types. And we certainly can help in follow-up with the kinds and types of questions, but agreement scale questions, confidence questions, case questions, mix it up so you're not using only one type of question. And always, always make sure that they are aligned with the gaps and the learning objectives. So just to recap here, here are the 5 keys again. Plan ahead, way ahead to eliminate surprises. Ending up at the end of an activity and realizing you don't have a plan or the resources to complete your outcomes assessment. Number 2, measure to your educational design. Over-measurement is a drain on resources, and often a waste of time, has less chance of success. Align, align, align. That really is the most important key to ensure your success. Key alignments would be gaps to content to questions. Of course, there's others in between. Keep the plan simple and specific. Really reduce your ambiguity here and be realistic. Also, using multiple types of assessment questions. Don't put all your eggs in one basket with the types of questions that you're using. So what do you do then to leverage the value of your outcomes results? We've talked about this a little bit, but what can you do with them? How can you use them? Really, if you summarize your results succinctly, and I talked about executive summary type of results, describing them that way, it can be used in a variety of ways. Number 1, you can validate your needs assessment. If your pre-scores, for instance, on a pre-survey, showed that knowledge levels were a little lower than they ought to be, or significantly lower than they ought to be, you've nailed your needs assessment. You can kind of quantify the degree to which you met your learning objectives if you've got good linkage there between your questions. So you can say, because people answered increased correct responses on this quiz, pre to post, we met XYZ learning objectives, or this is the degree to which we met them. You can look at different question types and over time establish which types of questions you like to use, which are effective with your audience. You can identify content which isn't, quote, performing well. If you believe your content is linked to your objectives and gaps, but you're finding that your outcomes measurement questions are not seeing changes, positive changes in your learners, maybe you have some content to review. Embolden the evidence for that content. Shift the content in some fashion. And of course, all of this is meant also to help inform future content development, make improvements in your content and process over time. Christopher, you mentioned the first one on this next slide, folding your outcomes measurement results back into a grant request.
Definitely helps a lot. If someone you're submitting a grant to sees that you've actually incorporated the results of a previous grant into a new one, it really begins to provide a cycle here where you're learning, you're applying what you're learning into the next program so that you're continuing to evolve your learners further and further along the continuum.
Yeah, and here are just listed some other things. I'll just mention the last one. Why not share your results in the clinical and CME community? And that could have variety to you. Sorry, that could add value to your organization in a variety of ways.
Derek, one other thing, we're talking about the assist commercial supporters in selling the value of CME within their organization. Sometimes just having your results reduced to 4 or 5 PowerPoint slides, which you can just readily present to an audience, and so that you summarize your results, it really helps you to engage internal stakeholders who have a say in your future budget. It can be used to communicate to your external stakeholders. So sometimes just being able to say something in a simple way and having a PowerPoint, because in some organizations PowerPoints are the currency of communication. So
yeah, thank you for that.
Sorry, Jeremy, continue on, please.
Yeah, so that's really Jeremy, you wanted to talk about some tools that can be used to achieve success in outcomes assessment.
Yeah, absolutely, and thank you both for a wonderful discussion. Obviously, as we mentioned at the beginning, tools, such as our Ethos CE learning management system or other types of tools. But also one of the things that I wanted to touch on, and I really appreciate not just, the points that you made about how this can be used for gaining commercial support, I thought were wonderful, but also focusing on how this really can be used to increase the perceived value of the CME department within an institution. It made me think of some of the barriers that my colleagues face. Who do you think would be some of the because I think collaborations, in addition to technology, but collaboration, whether it's with external partners or internally, is certainly a key to success with any type of strategic plan, and certainly the implementation. But within an organization, who would you say would be some of the key stakeholders that should be at the table and actively engaged in order to make outcomes assessment not just going from an idea or a plan that's been discussed, but actually becomes ingrained in the DNA of your organization?
Well, for nationally accredited CME providers, I realize we have a diverse group listening in here. Many hospitals and health systems, CME providers that may be state accredited, and then we have some nationally accredited CME providers. But what we've found is that when outcomes measurement and kind of the levels that you're targeting to measure are part of your mission, part of your vision for what you want to do as an organization, and are established with your CME director and even the deans, the executives, and other executives in your organization. When that mission is defined and includes outcomes, the kinds of outcomes you're pursuing, that can become very powerful and a guiding force for you. And so measuring to your design is what we focused on, but measuring to your mission is really important. Also, there's an important thing happening within health systems and hospitals with respect to CME, and many folks are trying to move from a model where they are a cost center and are giving out what some people refer to as CMEs, which hasn't been as good an approach as possible in that setting, moving to a situation where they're engaged with patient safety, quality improvement, quality assurance folks, and they're now a partner in achieving those goals, those quality goals. And many, as they've been able to do that, have facilitated it by being on the quality assurance or quality improvement committee, and vice versa, inviting those people to be on their committees to make CME more valuable. So, but I'm hoping we can get to some questions here, or was one of that was that one of the questions?
Yeah, well, and that's been kind of a common theme, and there's also been a number of questions around getting a little bit more in depth around some of the Moore's laws that you had been discussing earlier.
Moore's levels, yeah.
Moore's levels, I mean, sorry.
Some people consider them laws. They are levels, and it's a good framework to work from. There are other kind of models that people work from, stages of change, stages of learning, kinds of models. But can you be any more specific with what needs to be addressed with more levels?
Well, actually, that was the question was, and I think, and these obviously the questions were coming in as you were discussing, what are the appropriate, methods to use, and I think that they just was a desire for some elaboration on that.
Yeah. So,
or is are there other methods that you would recommend?
Yeah, I think there's, if you look carefully at Moore's article, and many of us have studied it, but we often don't go beyond the nice table that's shown there. and we nail down those levels and what's subjective and what's objective. But what we really need to do overall as a CME community is move from measuring just knowledge change to competence change, and then further up the ladder. So any effort that you can make to do that is helpful. So how do you measure competence change, for instance, in folks that are coming to an activity, say a grand round or a satellite symposium? How do you measure that? Well, some mini case vignette questions are good for this, because if you ask those pre and post, then you'll be able to assess what your learners would likely do with a patient if they saw that patient. And that's considered an objective measure of competence change using a case vignette. There's also measuring competence change. People have been doing that already to varying levels of quality or sophistication. So some people will ask in an evaluation form, do you plan to change your practice? Well, that's not quite good enough to measure competence change. Go beyond that to measure how do you plan to change your practice based on what you learned today. The next step would be give them a list. Please check all that apply. I plan to make the following changes in practice. Check all that apply. List the changes that you believe your content was going to motivate people to do. The things that you knew from your gap analysis they're not doing enough of, but now you're going to see if they will check those and do them. And leave an other category for them to specify what they might be changing. So that's another step up. We use an approach that's been published in several places called current and planned frequency of use. So it's as simple as, to measure a competence change, how often do you currently use each of the following clinical practice strategies? So it'd be a list of behaviors or things that you knew were deficient in your learners. Your content addressed that they should be doing these things according to the evidence-based practice. And you ask them, how often are you currently doing them? Never to always, 1 to 5 scale. And then how often do you now plan to do these things in your practice based on completing the activity today? And you can see that you get a measure of current frequency of use, planned frequency of use, and when that increases for something you intended them to do more often, that's a change in competence. They intend to do something good more often.
Great.
And so that's just an example. We should go to another question.
Yeah, and then just because we are coming up on the hour here, so I'm going to kind of consolidate about 3 questions into one, which is around resources. And I guess the way I would sum it up is obviously a lot of CME departments are under a lot of financial stress and the resource limitations. And someone asked, is what's being discussed here realistic if you don't have a biostats person on staff or available to you? So how realistic is what we're discussing here today in the context of having very limited resources?
Right. So in an organization where you have very limited resources, I guess you're not only measuring to your design or assessing to your design, you're assessing to your resources. But what I found is that through including the right kinds of people on your committees, you sometimes can draw people into helping you with this kind of thing. And that allows you to expand your resources. Clearly, there's less that you can do when you don't have those external resources, and you have to be realistic. But believe me, there are very, very simple ways that don't require a statistician for you to move your measurement, your assessment, from knowledge change, which sometimes can actually be more complicated if you've got pre and post questions and you've got to figure out, was there a statistically significant increase in knowledge change in knowledge pre to post? That can be fairly complicated for some folks. But
sure,
there are other ways to assess change that are very simple and incremental from perhaps where you're going, that require you only to be looking at percentages and frequencies or numbers of respondents and maybe some mean scores. And I realize that's a quick answer, but we'd certainly
Sure.
be happy to follow up on what could be done there.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I would like to thank everyone in our audience today. I do want to be mindful of everyone's time, and absolutely, again, would like to thank Derek and Christopher for their insights today.
Thank you.
Thank you.